about what you guys went over on Friday. First, starting with what equilibrium is, how to find the equilibrium price. Now remember, equilibrium price is just showing us the quantity of goods and services supplied when they are equal to the quantity demanded. So essentially that's the price they will go for. And you can always find the equilibrium price at the intersection point between the supply curve and the demand curve, wherever that intersection point may be. So that's our equilibrium price. And also related to equilibrium, what you went over last week, looking at the difference between surpluses and shortages. So just very briefly, again, a surplus is when there's unsold product in the store. So this is when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity that's demanded. So people aren't demanding a product, it's sitting on the shelves. Generally in a surplus, the price of those products tend to decrease as the producers, the businesses want to make sure they get some sort of profit. So they'll start to decrease that price in order to make sure that the demand increases a little bit to get that product sold. And then a shortage is the opposite. This is when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So there's not enough product to go around. Think of like hand sanitizer within the last month. Hard to find hand sanitizer anywhere, and if you do, it's usually at a much higher price than what it normally goes for. So eventually the quantity supplied of that product, like hand sanitizer, will eventually increase to meet the demand for that product. So does anyone have questions about finding equilibrium price or shortage or surplus before we move on? Hopefully it's pretty simple and straightforward. But if you have questions throughout the presentation today, feel free to speak up. You guys have the ability to mute and unmute yourself right now. So now that we understand where we find the equilibrium price, what happens then to that price if the supply curve were to shift, or if the demand curve were to shift? That is going to be our focus for today. So if you'll remember the past couple of weeks of this unit, we've been looking at the determinants that can shift a demand curve. There's 5 of them, and then the 6 determinants that can shift a supply curve. So now we're going to take those and see what happens when they shift, what happens to the price, and what happens to the quantity of those products. So starting with demand here, you can see this graph. Again, it's supply and demand graph together. So the red line, the red curve, that's referencing our supply. And then the blue curve labeled as D1, this is our original demand. Now we are seeing an increase in demand here, as you can see through this green arrow, an increase in demand from D1 to D2. So it's shifting to the right, so that's showing us an increase in demand it could be for a number of reasons. Think back to those 5 determinants of demand. Maybe someone got a new job, so then their demand, their income increased, okay? You could think of it like that, but this is just showing in general what an increase in demand looks like, and then what is happening to price and quantity. So if we are looking here, looking at the original intersection of the supply and the demand curve, you'll see this little dot here, the black dot that I just circled. That was the original equilibrium price. That was P1. But as the demand increased from D1 to D2 for whatever reason, you can see now with this big black dot, which I'm circling again, this is the new intersection of the supply curve and the new demand curve. So the equilibrium price has shifted. It's changed from P1 to P2. So the price has increased. Now, if we're looking at that, again, we have to take into account what happened to the quantity as well. So it went from Q1 to Q2. So the quantity also increased. Now, it's important to point out that when we're looking at an increase in demand right here, the relationship between demand and price, they're directly related to each other. So let's say instead of an increase in demand, we actually saw a decrease in demand. So if I'm drawing a new demand curve here, then we will find this new intersection point between our new supply curve our new demand curve and the supply curve, which would then bring our price down to this point here. So it's just important to point out that whenever the demand increases, the price will also increase. And if the demand decreases, the price will also decrease. And then quantity, whether it's related to demand or supply, quantity will also do the same thing. So in this instance, again, the quantity increased from Q1 to Q2, but if we were to decrease, that demand curve, the quantity would have decreased as well. So when we're referencing P's and Q's, we're just referring to price and quantity, what is happening as either the demand or the supply curve shifts. Now, if we're looking at this then, once again, but from a supply standpoint, again, the relationship between supply and price is going to be different than the relationship between price and demand. So now we see an increase in supply. Remember, if we're shifting the supply curve to the right, that's always signifying an increase. So we went from S1 to S2. And once again, going back to the original equilibrium price, we have P1 here, but then as we shifted our supply curve, the equilibrium price changed. So in this instance, even though the supply is increasing, the price is actually going to decrease. And then again, with quantity, like I mentioned before, whether it's the supply curve increasing or the demand curve increasing, the quantity will also increase as well. So we see it go from Q1 to Q2. And then, just to hit home the idea of the relationship between price and supply, let's say instead of an increase in supply, we saw a decrease in supply. So if this is our new supply curve, then we find our new equilibrium where the two curves meet, and then this price point would be the new price. So in this instance, even though it's a decrease in supply, the price would actually go up. And then obviously, if we were to follow it down to quantity, the quantity would have decreased. So quantity will always follow whatever the supply curve or whatever the demand curve is doing, whether that's increasing or decreasing. And then price and supply have sort of an inverse relationship with each other. If the supply is decreasing, then the price will increase, and vice versa. So this is looking at changes in P's and Q's, aka changes in the price of these products and changes in the quantities of these products, which is what we'll be focusing on for this week. Does anyone have questions on this before I go over one more example? Okay, I don't see anyone typing. Again, if you have questions, feel free to holler out during the presentation. Right now, we're just going to go over one part of the assignment that you guys are going to work on today. I want to do the first part with you just to make sure you understand what I'm looking for on each part. And you guys will have a summative on Wednesday of this week, which will look very similar to the assignment you're doing today. So I just want to make sure you guys are well prepared for that. So if you go to Schoology, I don't know if you can toggle, if you can pull up the Schoology app right now on your iPad. If you want to, you don't have to. Pull up the P's and Q's practice assignment. I'm just going to do the first part with you guys, scenario A, and then I'll cut you loose here. So just take a moment if you want to pull up your Schoology app and then pull up the P's and Q's practice. So this is what it should look like. Scenario A, that's what we're going to do together. I believe there's 5 scenarios total. But keep in mind, we've done assignments like this before when we did demand practice and we did supply practice, but now we're combining the two together. So your first task is having to figure out what is being affected here. Is it supply or is it demand? So before we ever figure that out, you always have to make sure you're keeping in mind what is the market that we're looking at. And the market here is oranges. So that's the product we are focusing on. Now the event is a 7.4 scale earthquake, that's a big earthquake, hits Mexico, destroying thousands of acres of orange groves. So again, the market is for oranges. What is being affected here? Supply or demand? Hopefully that's pretty simple to see. Anyone want to take a guess? Supply. Good job, Nick. Thank you. So for number 1, you can either circle supply or write supply on the line down there, but the supply of oranges is being affected. Now, number 2 is where it gets a little bit tricky. What factor, aka what determinant of supply, is causing this change? Anyone want to take a guess? Which of those 6 determinants is causing the change in supply of oranges? Thousands of acres of orange groves are going to be destroyed. So you lose out on selling those oranges. So the factor here Let's see, anyone typing? So for number 2, the answer is number of sellers. That's the determinant that's affecting the production or the supply of oranges. As these thousands of acres of orange groves are destroyed, there might be some orange producers who lose everything, so then they aren't able to sell oranges anymore. Okay, so for number 2, you can either put number of sellers or number 6 on there. That's fine. I would prefer if you actually write out number of sellers, just to keep in mind that we are still differentiating between supply and demand. So number 2 should be number of sellers. Okay, and then obviously if you're destroying orange groves, the supply of orange groves is going to oranges, is going to decrease. So for number 3, you can either circle decrease or write decrease in, that's fine. And then in order to answer number 4, I find that it's helpful to do number 5 first. So again, supply curve is changing and we see a decrease in supply. So how do we show that here? So you take your supply curve and now you're shifting it to the left if we're having a decrease in supply. So you might want to label that as 2. So remember, if it's shifting to the left, that's a decrease in supply. But if we're going back to the 2 original curves of demand and supply, remember where they first intersected, right here, that's their original price. So that would be P1 along with their original quantity. Okay, so if you want to label that Q1. And then as the supply curve shifted, now with this new supply curve and the new intersection point of demand, you got to find that new equilibrium price. So then we have P2 up here, and then you find the new quantity once again labeling it Q2. So for this instance, as the supply decreased, the price went up and the quantity went down. The quantity moved from Q1 to Q2, showing a decrease. So for number 4, you can say increase, decrease, up, down, that's fine, but you could just use arrows too. So for number 4, the price would increase and the quantity of those oranges would decrease. Okay, so the biggest part here when you're doing the rest of the scenarios is to make sure you're correctly identifying whether the change, the event that's happening, is going to affect the supply or the demand of that market, and what factor is affecting that change as well. Okay, does anyone have questions on this right now? Okay, hopefully it's pretty simple and straightforward. The task for the rest of the hour for you guys is to just complete the P's and Q's practice. I'm going to grade them as you turn them in today, just to give you guys some immediate feedback. Tomorrow I will post an optional P's and Q's practice number 2. So if you struggle today, look at your scores later on today, see how you did, see where you may have gotten some points off. I would highly encourage you to do that practice assignment tomorrow, but it's totally optional. You don't have to. On Wednesday, like I said before, there's going to be a summative assignment structured the same way this practice one is. It's going to be worth 25 points in the other summatives category. And then Thursday, it's a catch-up day. So if you are missing anything, use that day to just get those missing assignments in. There won't be any new work assigned. So it's a pretty simple and easy week. This Friday, you guys do not have school, and then next week, I think we start, I don't think you guys have school Monday either. Next week, we will start Unit 3, okay? So your task for the rest of the hour is